I'll be reading 1 Peter 4, 1 Peter 4, 7 through 11. Starting in verse 7. The end of all things is at hand, therefore be self-controlled and sober-minded for the sake of your prayers. Above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. Show hospitality to one another without grumbling. As each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. Whoever speaks, as one who speaks oracles of God, whoever serves, and one who serves by the strength that God supplies, in order that everything God may be glorified through Jesus Christ. To him belong glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen.
Good morning. As always, I'm really glad to be here with you all. For our congregation, we know that we're slowly working through the qualification for elders in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus chapter 1. And the way we've been doing that is we will have a sermon followed by a class the next Sunday. And so this morning's class, Trevor's leading that from his sermon last week. I do want some feedback on that style. I've talked to a couple of you who have enjoyed having a sermon class combo. Trevor and I have toyed briefly with the idea of maybe doing that with 1 Corinthians. There's a lot to cover in 1 Corinthians, and so trying to do it in a single quarter is tight. If this has been a productive thing, let us know. We would like to know if this has been beneficial. I've enjoyed it. I hope you have, but do let us know what you think about that. And we made the point in the first lesson that I think the way to see Titus and Timothy's qualification for elders is there is a singular quality that is being defined. The elders are to be above reproach, that they must be above reproach or beyond reproach, as Timothy and Titus say it. And then the rest of the list is helping us understand what that means, what that looks like. And so today we'll be looking at elders being above reproach in a category that I'm calling reasonableness. Might be a little surprising that we're just now getting to a category like that. After all, isn't part of being an elder being wise, being reasonable, being thoughtful? And that is true. But one of the reasons we're just getting into it now is we use Titus as the general pattern. We've been going through the list primarily in his order. And Timothy is the one who actually starts off with these ideas. In fact, the first thing he says after one woman man is temperate, sensible, and then we'll also be looking at considerateness. That these are three concepts we will be considering in regards to an elder being above reproach. That he's above reproach in his sobriety, he's above reproach in his sensibility, and he's above reproach in his considerateness. Now, one of the things that we also pointed out in that first lesson is that the list in Timothy and the list in Titus are not exhaustive. There's some things in Titus that are not in Timothy and vice versa. In fact, I really appreciated Dennis, who is out today, he's sick, but he pointed out in the class last week that he was shocked to realize patience is not in the list. You would kind of think that would be in the list of Timothy or Titus. It's not in there. And it reemphasizes this point that there are things that elders must be that aren't going to be spelled out in those lists, that these are non-exhaustive lists, that every piece is important, is necessary, but there will be things that are not there that we should consider. So we're going to look at these first two together, sobriety and sensibility. As I mentioned, the first two things that Timothy lists right after one woman man. And we'll do that in part because they're deeply related. So New American Standard uses the word temperate. I think sobriety is probably a better word. Sober or level-headed is another way versions might translate it. And then you have the idea of sensible. Some versions might say he's prudent or thoughtful. But these words are closely related, not just in Timothy, several other places where they show up, they show up in pairs. And so, for instance, in Titus chapter 2, talking to older men in general, he's describing some things they should be. He mentions temperate and sensible again. And in our scripture reading, I appreciate Lucas reading that for us. It's not in the adjective or noun form, but just like when we talked about fellowship And we said there's the concept of fellowship. There's a person who fellowships, a fellowshipper, but there's also the action of fellowship. There's this family of words. This happens with these two words, where the verb forms of these words also show up together. And one of those places is in 1 Peter 4:7. And as we're trying to understand these concepts and build a case for what does this look like, what does this mean, even though the words show up 4 or 5 times in the New Testament, most of the time they show up in lists. Lists aren't very helpful in helping you understand what it means. The writer is assuming you already know what it means so you can live it out. But the verbs are actually very helpful. We're looking at a couple passages in connection with these verbs that help us understand what does he mean that he has sound thinking or he's sensible? What does he mean that he's sober-minded or he has a sober spirit? And so in verse 7 here, the verb forms of these concepts show up. So we'll be unpacking a couple verses from 1 Peter 4 to help us understand when Paul writes to Timothy that elders need to have sober minds, need to be sensible. What is he trying to get across? And so we're going to start that first verse where he says, the end of all things is at hand. And so he's saying that, and this is, again, actually, this text is to all Christians. 1 Peter is not really about elders in this section, but we're using this to help us understand this concept. So all Christians need to recognize the end of all things is at hand, but he says, because of that, be sensible. He's connecting this idea of sensibility and sober-mindedness to the recognition that this world is temporary. Our lives are temporary. There is an end date. We have an expiration date, if you want to think about it that way. It's just, so he says, be sensible, be thoughtful. And so the first point we're going to draw out is when we're looking at someone who's a potential candidate for an elder, you want someone who sees the world for the way it really is. He sees reality clearly. And what I mean by that is this recognition that everything I can see, everything I can touch, everything I can taste is less real than God is less real than heaven is, even though I can't touch heaven yet, and I can't see heaven yet. Because of the temporal nature of this world, is one day the very atoms on the pews you were sitting on will cease to exist. Not just the chair will break down and be thrown in the landfill. The things that make it up, God's going to undo, which means your relationship with God is more real than the chair you're sitting on right now. Wisdom, friendship, these concepts are more real because they're eternal, in contrast to the world we live in. So you're wanting an elder who's sensible, who's sober-minded, and realizes that is the case, that reality, the reality we can't touch and see yet, is more real than the one we can. So they're always having in mind the end is near, and they're making choices for themselves and for the congregation with that in mind. And that results in them being able to wisely prioritize things that they should, making choosing choice A over B because A is more important in the grand scheme of life, that A is more important in recognizing that the world is going to end. That you're looking for an elder who can model that and also help his sheep learn how to do that. This is what we do as parents for our kids. When a kid wants to make choice A, B, or C, we think, okay, are there any negative ramifications for making any of these choices? And if not, if they're all neutral, then what is the better choice? What's the more important choice? Is there a priority that should take precedence? And you're looking for an elder who's going to help you do that on the spiritual level. That he's going to say, these things are more important. These things need priority because of what reality actually is. Because of the end of all things is near. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. We can spend a whole lesson just thinking about this. But next time you're thinking about prayer, next time you're studying about prayer, come here and think about this for a while. That he says, okay, you need to be sensible and sober-minded because the end of all things is near. But he also says, for the purpose of prayer, that we want elders who pray effectively. And so one of the points to draw out of this text is if you want to pray effectively, if we want elders to pray effectively, having a sober spirit and having sensibility are prerequisites. I don't know if you have thought much about that. We're not going to unpack all of that this morning. But to pray effectively requires clear heads and clear thinking. an ability to reason and be rational. And this is what he says. He says, have sound thinking and be sober-minded for the purpose of prayer. And so one thing to be thinking about and looking for an elder. Jumping to the next verse, he mentions that above all, keep fervent in your love for one another, because love covers a multitude of sins. That line, he's quoting the Old Testament, but it's looking to the end. He's looking to Judgment Day and saying, well, how is God going to judge you? So he's keeping that in the background right there. But this is another one of those things that I've not really thought a ton about. But here's his point, that I need to love well, I have to be sensible. I have to be sober-minded. And this was not shocking, but just really interesting to me as to putting this lesson together, because we live in a culture that wants to separate these ideas. We live in a culture that wants to paint love and intelligence as kind of opposites. I don't know how many of you are big Star Trek fans, but you're probably familiar, at least loosely, with Star Trek and some of the major characters. And one of the major characters is a guy named Spock. And Spock kind of represents intelligence, logic, rationality, and the lack of emotion, the lack of affection, the lack of love. Now, he's I forget what his race is, but he's half human, and so he struggled. There's this internal struggle inside of him in the storyline. But what Peter is saying here is that dichotomy, that split between love and rationality, is not biblical. That the way God sees it, the way the Bible describes it, is if you want to love well, you have to think well. One way to say this is sound minds lead to sound love. And one of the reasons that's true, and it's probably not a surprise to any of you, the recognition that our culture at a large, especially this secular culture, but even the religious culture, has attempted to co-opt God's word love to defend things that God says are outright sinful. That they have attempted to redefine love in such a way so that they can then take a look at the action and say, well, this is done in love, or this is loving, therefore how can it be bad? And the response to that is, well, you are defining love in that way, but God is the one who gets to define what love actually is. And to do that, to have that conversation, requires sound thinking, requires healthy thinking, requires sensibility and sobriety to be able to have that conversation. And so to love well, I have to think clearly, to think well. And when you're looking for elders, you're looking for someone who understands, who comprehends, who sees clearly God's love in their life. One of the reasons that's so important is the parable about the servant who was forgiven. And the point of the master is saying, you can't see things clearly. I forgave you all this debt, and you couldn't see that you should do the same for your fellow slave who owed you way less than you owed me. You're looking for elders who see themselves clearly, see the love of God clearly, and are able to have a clear view of that, to think soundly, think sensibly, think soberly around that, so that plays out in their life, that affects them, but also so they can help the sheep understand that. That it's the elder's job to help the sheep understand the love of God for them and in their life. And so you need an elder who is sensible and sober, so he is able to do that. Last point we'll make on this verse is that sensibility is a prerequisite for fervency. And what I mean by that is there's going to be days you wake up and you don't feel like loving your spouse, loving your children, loving your boss. Fill the person in your life. There's going to be days you wake up and you don't feel like loving God's people the way he says. And the mature Christian says, yeah, I don't feel like it, and I'm going to do it anyway. How are they able to do that? How are they able to make the decision that when the world says love is always an outgrowth of natural emotion, and when you feel the right way, you live the right way? When God says, no, that's not the way that works. You have to live the right way, even if you don't feel the right way. How do you do that? You think clearly. You make a commitment. You make a rational judgment and say, you know what? This is what God says it means to love and to serve and to aid. And I'm going to do that anyway. I know how I feel, and that's not what I want to do, But you want an elder who's going to do that, because there's going to be days as a sheep you're not very lovable, because it's true for all people. And you want an elder who is able to commit to loving you fervently anyway. All of us should be that, by the way. All of us are being called to that. And this text is not just for elders here, but we're applying it to that specific context right now. And so, but the elder has to have a clear head, a sober mind to be able to do that. Last point we'll draw from 1 Peter. We'll skip verse 9 because we talked about hospitality in the class. So verse 10, he says, as each one has received a gift, employ it in serving one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. I love this verse for so many reasons. One is that he talks about being stewards of God's manifold grace. That God's grace is not one-sided. It's not just one thing. There are many, many parts to that grace. We don't have time to unpack that this morning. And we're stewards of that. That grace is a resource we're supposed to be using and benefiting God's kingdom with. Those are just not the ways people often talk about grace. But the relevant point we're making is we have to be sensible to recognize what are God's gifts that He's given us. What are the parts of grace I've received? What various forms of grace have I received in my life? I have to have a clear head, a sensible mind to be able to recognize that. And then he says it's not just about seeing those graces, it's about using those graces, being stewards of those graces. And so, how does God want me to steward the grace in my life? You want an elder who's able to identify that in his life and then use that in his life so that he can then help you do the same thing. That he can help you identify what are the graces that God has in your life that you're supposed to be stewarding for the benefit of his people and his kingdom and God himself. To stress this, I want to bring in a second verse in Romans 12, a text that's probably familiar to a lot of you. Many people study Romans 12 a decent bit. He says in verse 3, for through the grace given to me, I say to each one among you not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think, but to think so as to have sound thinking. That's our verb, the being sensible verb there. As God has allotted to each one a measure of faith. For just as we have many members in one body, and all the members do not have the same function, so we, who are many, are one body in Christ, and individually members one of another. But having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, whether prophecy in agreement with the faith, or in service in his serving, or he who teaches in his teaching, or he who exhorts in his exhortation, he who gives with generosity, he who leads with diligence, he who shows mercy with cheerfulness. I'm going to jump back real quick. Notice in that verse 3 when he says, but to think as having sound thinking. One of the things he says is he does not think more highly of himself than he ought to. The part of reasonable thinking, rational thinking, is being able to see oneself, your abilities, and your failings clearly. That he does not exalt himself or think too highly or unreasonably highly of himself. He has a clear picture of who he is and what he's able to do, what he's not able to do. What are the gifts of grace? He uses that phrase there, if you notice, in verse, what do you say? Maybe it's in the thing. In verse 6, having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us. I suspect, and I haven't done a ton of study on this point, I suspect that this idea and the 1 Peter 4 idea are basically equivalent ideas. There may be a distinction there that should be nuanced out, but I think they're in general the same concept. So you want an elder who can think clearly and have sound judgment and looking at himself and doesn't think himself as more important, more wise, more significant than others, but has a clear picture of that. Now, let me clarify that. Our small group is reading the Screwtape Letters, and C.S. Lewis does a really good job on the letters describing humility as true forgetfulness, self-forgetfulness, in contrast to pretending something is not real. What I mean by that is sometimes we think humility, with sound thinking of not exalting ourselves, is denigrating our abilities and our talents in a way that just aren't true. If you are a professional quarterback, it's just false to say you're a bad quarterback. You made it to a professional league. You are the best quarterbacks in the world if you're playing at that level. Even if your team's not great, you're still one of the best, and that's just objectively true. So someone who has true humility is able to identify, are they good or not good at something, and yet that when they are good, when they are talented, when they do have this ability or resource, that does not cause them to think they're more important or more valuable than others. They don't exalt themselves because of it. This is the idea we're talking about. Someone who has sound thinking. They see themselves clearly, their pros and their cons, their abilities and their faults, and yet it does not cause them to exalt themselves. And he then connects that idea to the idea of giving these different gifts that's based on the grace of God. And again, you're looking for an elder who can see that in himself. But Ephesians chapter 4, there is this call, there is this need to equip saints for the work of service, the building up of the body of Christ. You want an elder who's able to help you identify what are your gifts, what are your abilities, and how do you use them in the kingdom. And to have an elder who can do that, you need someone who has sound thinking, who's sensible, who is able to think clearly. So summing all of this up, that you're looking for someone that has the wisdom to know what is important in God's eyes, and thus how and when to use God's gifts to accomplish God's designs. Someone who is sensible, reasonable in this regard. Now, there's one slight distinction between temperate and prudent, sensible here that I thought necessary to highlight. I'll just use one verse to do so. 1 Peter 5:8 is the famous verse where Satan described as a lion, where he says, be of sober spirit, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. If there is a distinction between these two ideas, it's this. That the idea of temperance or sobriety includes a specific kind of wisdom that guards against danger. The words temperance and sobriety are often connected to being careful with wine or maybe drugs in general and not allowing it to cloud your judgment, not getting to the point where you were drunk. And there's a reason for that. That is a consistent picture. But the concept is broader than just that. And this is one of the places where you see this warning, this call to be careful about the dangers of your life, the dangers of Satan, his lies, his deceptions, and to watch out for that. That if you are sober, you are guarded against realistic and serious danger. In fact, an interesting point, you can go look at this, you get the email with the different places this verb gets used, and you can go see this, that in all of the places may be debatable in 2 Timothy, but I would say it's still true even in that case. In all the places this verb shows up, it's always in the context of looking to Judgment Day and resurrection. It's always looking forward to that moment. So here in 1 Peter, that's in the background context. In 1 Thessalonians 5, where it shows up. In our context in 1 Peter 4, we highlight the end of all things is near. Every place this word shows up is in the context of looking forward to Judgment Day and being careful about the spiritual danger that lurks around the corner, because Satan wants to devour you. Now, this is not surprising because this plays exactly into the very instruction of work that elders are given in Acts 20. When Paul calls the elders of Ephesus to Miletus, and he's giving them his kind of last farewell speech, because he says, you won't see me again. I'm going to be arrested, and you just won't see me in this life again. And they weep about that. He says in verse 28 and 30 that God has made you these overseers to take care of, to be concerned and protect the sheep from the wolves who are going to come in and lead people away with perverse sayings. And so you want an elder. An elder needs to be sober-minded to be able to identify these dangers so that they can protect the sheep and help them understand what choices are safe and what choices are not safe in their spiritual walk with God. So summarizing these, the questions you want to ask yourself and looking at a potential candidate is, okay, are they able to identify subtle dangers to the soul? Because Satan doesn't come waving a giant red flag saying, hey, follow me to hell. That's not the way he approaches us. He lies, he deceives, he tricks. And so an elder needs to have the ability and wisdom experience to be able to identify those subtle dangers. And I have more I can say about that, but I will just pause. I'll just end on that note. Related is, okay, once he's able to identify, is he able to, does he know how to address those with the individuals, with the congregation? Is he able to explain them to those who are willing to listen? Now, anyone who has been a parent, who is a parent, knows there'll be times where you try to explain something to your 5-year-old, your 10-year-old, your 15-year-old, and it just won't click yet. They don't have enough maturity yet to understand. And so there is some play with this kind of idea. When you say, is he able to explain it? Is he able to describe it? Does he have the wisdom to know how to address it? But like everything as we've been talking, all of it's going to involve some judgment call. But that's the kind of thing you're asking. Okay, can he identify it, and then can he address those dangers? Is he able to identify and guide the sheep into their spiritual gifts, into the abilities and talents and resources God puts in their life, and how they ought to use them and what they ought to look like? Whether that's being teachers and evangelists, or whether that's being mothers and fathers, or whether that's being bosses or employees, what is it that's in their life, and does the elder have the ability to coach and to guide? One of the things that you have to understand if you want to be an elder one day, which 1 Timothy 3:1, it's a good thing to desire. It's an honorable thing to desire that work. But to understand, you're volunteering to be a coach in all things life, regardless of your experience. Whether you think you are or are not qualified, you are stepping into the role to say, I'm going to help people try to figure out the life decisions and spiritual decisions they ought to be making. I have stories about that as a preacher. If you want to hear about them later, let me know. Last question we'll say here. One of my favorite usages of this verb here is, are they in their right mind? That gets used of the people who were demon-possessed and demons are cast out of them. They're now in their right mind. Paul uses it that way over in 1 Corinthians. It says, if we are in our right mind, it is for the Lord. And so this idea relating to, are they wise? Are they clear-headed? Are they level-headed? Are they thinking clearly? Are they rational? Those are the kinds of ideas that you're thinking about when you think about temperate or sober and sensible or prudent. And because we're using Titus, the next thing we talk about, the third thing we'll talk about today, isn't right after this list. But it is in Timothy. It's not in Titus's list, but he talks about an elder being considerate. Some verses we're going to say gentle. Some verses might say yielding or kind. Those are all reasonable translations. This word is contrasted to striker right before it, not pugnacious, not a striker. And we could have included in that lesson, but that would have been like 5 items, and it was tight squeezing 4 in the first place. And so we're including it here. But there is this connection to this idea of peaceable. It shows up with peaceable over in Titus 3:2, a statement that is applying to all Christians, not just elders there, and a similar peace word in James 3:17. So there is definitely this concept of gentleness. Considerateness may not automatically have idea of gentle in your mind, but I'm saying that is entailed in this concept. It's often paired with this idea of peace. It's contrasting being a striker. But what does it mean? Like, what does this look like? Well, there's 2 verses I think are really helpful. We'll look at these 2 verses and then be done. One is in 1 Peter 2:18, where he's talking to servants, as servants, be subject to your masters with all fear, not only to those who are good and considerate, that's our same word, but to those who are crooked. And so here, he has this instruction to servants or employees and say, to your bosses, to your masters, how do you treat them? How do you react to them? That's the main point. But we're going to use this to say, okay, what does this mean? And the question that comes out of that is, what makes a good boss? What makes a boss or a master considerate and good? That's the question you have to answer to understand what this concept is. Well, at the very least, good bosses are good stewards of their resources. That they understand the money, the land, the minerals, the experience, whatever it is they have, they understand those resources and they use them well, to the point that they make reasonable and attainable goals and plans. That They look at the resources and they're able to say, okay, so we can do X, Y, and Z because we have A, B, and C. That we're able to understand what they have and what can actually be accomplished. Now, the main point in 1 Peter is the resources of people. And that's probably the thing you want to primarily be focusing on with elders as well. Do they have reasonable expectations? If they were a boss, or if they maybe are a boss, maybe they manage people, maybe they run a company, and you're looking at the way they do that and say, okay, are their expectations of their employees reasonable, understandable, attainable? Are they considerate of the abilities their employees have and the inabilities or disabilities the employees have? Are they able to look at the people who are under their charge, and are they seeking to take care of them as well as accomplish their goals? That they're balancing those things. And one of the reasons we included this word here is because to make that judgment call, you have to be sensible and sober-minded. That is a rational call, a judgment call, a sound thinking call. And one of the points I want to highlight here that you're looking for in elders is someone who has reasonable expectations, includes the elder is able to see the potential in your life that maybe you don't see yet. Good bosses, good coaches, good teachers are able to see the potential in the people under their charge, even if those people can't see it in themselves yet. And they're able to challenge and equip and push in such a way that it pulls out that potential and makes it reality. That's part of being a good boss. And that you're looking for an elder who's going to push you to grow spiritually, who's not going to leave you where you're at, but challenge you to meet your spiritual potential in God's kingdom. And that requires sensibility and sobriety to be able to see that and make that judgment call. And he's contrasting this to someone who was crooked. Someone who is willing to be dishonest. We kind of talked about that somewhat this morning in class. That they have no problem taking advantage of business partners who aren't paying attention. And they're unscrupulous. I chose that one because, again, the main point in 1 Peter is how is the master treating his servants. But that they don't consider situations that go on in the servant's life. The servant gets injured, and he says, I know you're injured, but you still got to do the exact same work you did before you were injured. Or maybe the servant is going through a really challenging time, lost a spouse, lost a child. It's like, I know you're grieving, but that doesn't change anything. You still have to do X, Y, and Z. And there might be moments where the master or the shepherd has to look at someone and say, I know this is hard, but it maybe is true. I still need to do X, Y, and Z. You need a master who is considerate and able to decide, can we change things or can we not change things? Because there are some times where you can't change things for whatever reason. And so you're looking for someone who has scruples, who cares about justice and fairness and is concerned for the well-being of the people he leads, who is honest, who's going to tell you the way things really are, who's going to be upfront, and when he says it, he means it. If he makes a commitment, he sticks to it. That's the kind of person you're looking for, who is considerate. One more verse, and then we will wrap up in Philippians 4, verse 4 and 5. He says, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Let your considerate spirit be known to all men. The Lord is near. And so the context of Philippians is this joy despite sorrow, despite suffering. Paul's in prison when he writes this. It's very possible he's going to be executed. Throughout these chapters, he's talking about what he was glad to sacrifice for Jesus because Jesus is such a great value. And so that's the larger context. And so when you're looking for an elder to be considerate, you're looking for someone that understands consideration, shows consideration in the face of sorrow. That's true for himself and for others. That someone who is gentle and in the abstract, not in the physical sense, but in the kind of spiritual sense or abstract sense. Someone who understands suffering that you're going through because he's gone through it himself and has reasonable expectations through that suffering. And is going to help you have reasonable expectations through that suffering. And again, you don't want a boss who's going to say, yeah, sorry you lost your kid, you still got to show up tomorrow. Life moves on. You're looking for someone who is willing to be considerate, who understands that suffering, and is willing to walk through it himself. And despite the sorrow in this life, does he meet this picture of rejoicing always? Again, Paul is making this point, not that sorrow isn't real, not that suffering isn't real, and not that it doesn't matter, but he's saying if we are in Christ, the joy of Christ and the hope of resurrection, the hope to be with loved ones is so profound, it changes the way we sorrow. It changes the way we grieve. And does the elder model that? Is he able to appreciate and sit with the sorrow in himself or with others? Is he comfortable being around sad people? That's not something that America's done great, but I do think that's changing in our culture because there's been much more conversation about this. And so does the elder know how to do that? And despite that, is he able to redirect us to Jesus and the hope we find in Jesus? You're looking for someone who can show consideration in that way. He mentions this idea of letting your spirit be made known to all men. I think that one of the ways to think about this is, does he know when something is important, you need to put your foot down, and when something isn't important, you don't need to put your foot down? Does he know when to let someone else have their way? Is he willing to consider that maybe he would have gone with choice A, but this other person really wants choice B, and he realizes that's okay. We're going to go with that choice because it is not necessary for me to always have my way. And does he do this for all people? So not just his family, not just even Christians or his favorites, but all people. Is he show consideration for everyone? Having the wisdom to know when he has to put his foot down, saying, no, we have to do it X, Y, and Z. When he says, no, it's okay to do it in the ABC way. And he's able to show that consideration when it is viable. Last point we'll make here is the Lord is near. It's interesting how we started with this point. We're coming back to this point. And there's a point where that's always immediately true. Jesus is here. God is here. They are omnipresent. They're always with you. But I think he's primarily looking forward to the moment when you're able to see that and touch that in heaven following the judgment day. The Lord is near. And so you have this recall that the idea of sobriety being connected to these same ideas. And so consideration takes into account the temporal nature of this world. It's one of the reasons why we group these words together, because there's a lot of overlap between them. And so the questions you want to ask yourself as someone to consider it, as a potential elder, consider it, is, okay, would this candidate be someone you want to work for as a boss? Because when you want them to be an elder, you're asking them to, in some sense, be a boss of sorts. They don't just have abject authority, but they do have authority. So would you want to be their employee? How does he handle suffering and sorrow? Does he do it well in his own life? Does he do it well in the lives of others? Showing compassion where it's appropriate, and also helping them see the joy in Jesus despite the sorrow. Does he consider the temporal nature of the world, again, deeply related to sobriety? And lastly, would he know when to let the sheep have their way? And one of the most helpful pieces of advice that I received before getting married was this older Christian said, if it doesn't matter, let her have her way. Because as the husband, you can put your foot down. You can force your will. And so if it doesn't matter, let her have her way, so that when you do put your foot down, she knows that it's for her benefit, from your understanding. Elders play the same kind of role. And so does this elder, would this potential elder know when to let the sheep have their way? Because it's okay to do it this way versus that way. Those are the kinds of questions you're looking for. Because you're looking for an elder who's going to be like the chief shepherd, who's going to model Jesus in his life and in the lives, and encouraging the sheep to model Jesus in their lives. You're looking for someone who is going to help you see the beauty of Jesus in their life and in your own life. So that Jesus' sacrifice of himself on the cross brings about the fruit God desires. That he wants to see his people with him forever. and you want elders who are keeping that in their minds so they can help you keep that in your minds. If you have any spiritual need that we can help with, if we can encourage, strengthen, pray for you in some way, if we can, in a small way, fulfill in part the role an elder plays in a congregation, we want to know how we can do that. So if you have any spiritual need, let us know as we stand and as we sing.